Happy Tuesday, guys. Ta-da! And happy week 8 million of e-learning. Um, it is Sunday evening for me, but this is posting for a Tuesday, so I am wearing my crown. And I just wanted to remind you of a few things. First, don't forget to be reading your book. Also, a few of you misunderstood that the book needs to be non-fiction. So some of you picked fiction books. That won't work. You need to switch and switch fast so you can get that taken care of. But it does need to be nonfiction. Refer back to the first week link on the main page. There's information there about the nonfiction book style. Okay. Another thing, starting next week, we will be having e-learning Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So we added a day to cut off a week. So for example, my son, who goes to Avon, is still going 3 days a week, but he goes until the 22nd. We are out the 15th. So we have school one extra day a week so that we can get out a week early, which is nice. Some trade-offs, but so just remember that you will have 4 days of e-learning, not just the normal 3 that we have been doing. Okay, I know it's a lot of changes and it's very confusing, but just make sure you're checking your email, especially from me. Some of you didn't do assignments correctly or didn't link things correctly, and I've been emailing you, but you're not checking your emails, so you never get my emails. So please make sure to check your emails. It's super important during this e-learning time. Today we are going to talk about concrete poetry, which is some of my favorite. Now, it is not poems that are written out of concrete or written on top of concrete. It has nothing to do with that. But it does have to do with another definition of the word concrete, which means like a physical thing. Something that is concrete is physical, or something that's touchable, tangible. And so, though the poems are not touchable, I mean, you could touch a piece of paper, but that's not, it's not what we were going with. They make use of space on the page. And that is super important to not just like, oh, they decided to space it weird. Usually, concrete poetry is different than just odd spacing. The spacing helps create meaning. Now, there are some poems that are just spaced weird for whatever reason the poet wants to do it, but those aren't necessarily concrete unless it adds to the meaning of the poem. Some of you already did this in some of your poems, which I was like, wow, they did a thing and I didn't even tell them about it yet. So maybe you already know about concrete poetry, and if you do, this will be a super easy lesson for you. So I'm going to stop here, flip the screen around, and I'm going to show you some examples of concrete poetry, and then I'm going to talk to you about your assignment. Okay, guys, these are the notes. You don't necessarily need to have them open while you watch this video. You may want them when you go to write your own. But since I'm showing them to you and I'm not giving you any additional notes, this will probably be just fine. So there are a couple kinds of concrete poetry. The first and most basic kind is a poem that is in the shape of an object. So the example over here is the poem is about a dog, and the dog is holding a tennis ball in its mouth, and it talks about that in the poem. Okay, very elementary schoolish. This one, the resolution is absolutely horrid, and I apologize. I just realized that. I'll try to find one with a better resolution for when you look at the handout. But this is a poem about acceptance and that sort of thing, and you notice the different colors of quote-unquote skin of the people holding hands, okay? And also the words get closer together to provide shading. So they squeeze the words close. I'm motioning with my hands as if you can see me, to provide a shading. So it's also art. Okay, so that's a very, though this one is not what you would call simple, this is a very simplistic style of concrete poetry and not really what I want you to do for our topics. There are even more basic ones where you like make a poem about Christmas in the shape of a Christmas tree, or make a poem about night in the shape of a moon. Those are awful. Definitely don't do those. Okay? That's something that you would do in elementary school. And in an honors class, I want you to do something a little bit more intense. Okay? Now, this, I mean, if it was that intense, I would accept it, no questions asked, because that would take a lot of work and thought. This, on the other hand, I would like give you 1 out of 20 points. Okay, because it's very simplistic and the poem itself is not even that great. But I mean, it's not meant to be a great poem, great piece of literature. It's meant to be lighthearted and funny. But so there you go. The second kind, which is really what I want you to focus on, is a poem that uses interesting line breaks that contribute to the meaning of the poem. One of my favorite poets of all time is E. E. Cummings, and he is my favorite poet that uses concrete things. And I absolutely love this poem. This is the first time I was ever introduced to concrete poetry. My English teacher had us read this poem, and I just fell in love with it. And maybe that's why I say just a lot. Who knows? The poem is entitled In Just. Technically, Cummings didn't title any of his poems. The titles of his poems are just the first line. But here we go. In just spring, when the world is mud luscious, and the little lame balloon man whistles far and wee, and Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies, and it's spring, when the world is puddle wonderful. The queer old balloon man whistles far and wee, and Betty and Isabel come dancing from hopscotch and jump rope, and it's spring, and the goat-footed balloon man whistles far and wee. So there are a lot of elements of this poem that are concrete. The spacing here, I don't know, you could get really philosophical and talk about stuff like that, but let's not get philosophical. Here we've got whistles far and wee, so the spacing here kind of emphasizes the far. One of the things I like is the Eddie and Bill and Betty and Isabel being squashed together. I think you guys read Lord of the Flies in middle school, and there were the twins, Sam and Eric. And for a while, it was Sam space and space Eric. But as the novel went on and the author was trying to symbolically show that people couldn't really tell them apart and they almost became one person, the name became Sam and Eric. No spaces. And this is a very similar style. Eddie and Bill are best friends. They're close together. Betty and Isabel are close together. And again, we have whistles far and wee. And then we just have this kind of playful placement of words, adding to the playfulness of the poem itself. Okay, so this is a relatively simple example of it, but the idea is to use the spacing to help aid in the meaning of the poem or the mood of the poem. Okay. Another example is by the novelist Ellen Hopkins. She was really, really popular about 5 or 6 years ago. I had girls wanting her books all the time, so I went out and bought a ton of them. And she wrote novels, but in poetic form, and she really blew me away. I wasn't really excited about her at the beginning. But let me see if I can make this bigger. Yeah. But then I realized there was quite a bit of craft in the way she was writing these novels via poetry. And the title is always important in hers because it is a part of what the person is saying. And you can just notice by looking at it, these things are pushed off to the side. And at first glance, you may really just kind of be like, oh, well, that was weird that she did that. But I'm going to read the poem to you twice. First, I'll just read it normally. I am not sure why I knew that then. Call it intuition. Whatever it was, my mind swayed from fear and uncertainty. My heart veered from hurt and bitterness toward the unlikely idea that, away from home, my future might blossom with hope. Okay, so that's reading it normally, but also the words she set aside create their own poems, sort of, or at least their own message. Intuition swayed my heart toward future hope. And she does this a lot in her book. All of her, well, not all, the vast majority of the poems within each novel are concrete in some way. Some of them are just in regular stanzas, but many of them are like this, where the poem itself has double meaning. And sometimes it's like hidden, like what is set apart over here is actually, when you read it by itself, shows that the character is lying, because over here it will say one thing, but if you just read this, it says something completely different. I couldn't find an example of that because I couldn't remember one off the top of my head, and I don't have my Ellen Hopkins books here at home. They're all at school. But anyway, it gives you a different idea, a more traditional look at a poem than this, In Just by E.E. Cummings. Then I thought, just for kicks and giggles, I would show you another E.E. Cummings poem that is called Grasshopper. And this is the poem. And like a grasshopper, this poem jumps around. The poem can be read. I am not going to read it to you because I really would like you to kind of figure it out on your own. I am going to give you a hint here in a minute, or if you have the document up, you already see the hint. But by telling you technically this is the title of the poem, because like I said, E.E. Cummings poems are titled just by the first line. But this is one hint, that the title of the poem is Grasshopper. But another hint is this little image where a person took the middle of the poem and showed you, like, played kind of like connect the dots, where Cummings attempted to make the poem actually even look like a grasshopper, which just, the first time I ever saw this poem, totally blew my mind. But very cool. If you can figure it out, it just takes some time. You've got to read through it, rewrite it a little bit, or some of you, those of you who have a very visual brain, may be able to just look at it and see the poem as is. It took me a while, and I even consider myself to be a visual learner, but those are just some exciting examples of concrete poetry. And I'm going to flip around, and actually no, I'll just go ahead and tell you now. Your assignment is to write a concrete poem. And I would kind of like for you to stay more along the lines of either Ellen Hopkins or E.E. Cummings. Unless you are planning on going super intense, you can do that. And when you go to turn it in, you can do a lot of different things. Obviously, typing something like this is going to be very different. So if you wanted to draw out your poem and turn in a picture, I will allow you to do that as well. But I want you to do two things. First, you're going to label it like you have been labeling them with the poetic devices. Some of you have been using colors. Some of you have been using the comments. Whichever, or a mixture of both is fine. But then I also want you to, at the bottom, to write out an explanation as to why you made the choices that you made. Hopefully I'll be able to pick up on your reasoning, but if I can't, I'd like to read what your reasoning is, okay? On the assignment, there is an example that I wrote. You don't need to read it. That's not part of the assignment, but if you want to look at either how I'm labeling things, which there aren't a lot of labels in this poem, or if you want to see what I mean by explain your concrete choices. I did that on the poem as well. It's the first page is just the poem itself, and then the second page is where I marked it up. Okay. All right. I hope you're having a great Tuesday, and yeah. Bye, guys.